All right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Rich Condon of Pennsylvania and the Civil War. Tonight, we have a special guest with us, Steve Phan from the Civil War Defenses of Washington. And tonight, we're actually going to talk about the Civil War Defenses of Washington and the role that Pennsylvanians played in not only constructing them, but also occupying them throughout the war. If you followed along for some of our other Facebook Live broadcasts or Zoom broadcasts, you know, obviously we're doing this because of the current situation. COVID-19 is kind of restricting us to our homes. This is something that we'll probably be doing for the foreseeable future. So as you're watching tonight, please comment in the comment section, ask us questions for either us or our guest tonight. And just let us know you're here. We'd like to hear from you. We like to interact with you. Sometimes we tend to get bored just talking amongst ourselves. So with that being said, over the next 45 minutes to an hour, we're going to talk about the Civil War Defenses of Washington, starting with Steve. But first, I'd like to go around the group here and have everyone kind of introduce themselves. Jake, we'll start with you.
Hi, everyone. I am Jake Wynn. I am a public historian, work at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine and the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I also write and contribute to PennCivilWar, and I write about Northeastern Pennsylvania's history at winninghistory.com.
Who's next? Cody.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, I'm Cody, and my day job is at the Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I, in my free time as well, and aside from PennCivilWar, have my own blog, Cody H, writer and historian, focused mostly on kind of the legacy and memory of the Civil War era. I'm also part of the Battles and Banter military history podcast.
Kendrick?
And I'm Kendrick Gibbs. I'm a public historian based out of Richmond, Virginia, one of the co-founders of PennCivilWar. I also run another page called Keystoners in Union Blue. And I currently am at the Hanover Tavern Foundation, which is a historic tavern nonprofit just north of Richmond. And let's go forth with tonight.
And we also have the head of the John Fulton Reynolds fan club here, Steve Phan.
Yes, you see General Reynolds in the background, of course. Thanks for having me, gents. It's an honor to be here. My name is Steve Phan. I'm a historian and park ranger at the Civil War Defenses of Washington. We are a regional program within Washington, D.C. We manage 17 sites and a national cemetery, working with 3 national parks in the National Capital Area or region, Rock Creek Park, National Capital Parks East, and George Washington Memorial Parkway, and look forward to talking about the defenses of Washington and Pennsylvania's role in the defenses as well.
All right, so if anyone's not really familiar with the Civil War Defenses of Washington, I highly recommend, once all of these restrictions are lifted, to check them out. What is it, Steve, 67 or 68 defenses around Washington?
68 major forts, 93 earthen gun artillery batteries, over 30 miles of military road, 30 miles of earthworks, 800 to 900 artillery pieces, one of the most heavily fortified cities in the world during the Civil War.
Okay, I'll admit you have Pittsburgh beat in terms of defenses.
We have real guns, not Quaker guns, Rich.
So before we get started, I just want to kind of give everyone a little background. You know, the Civil War Defenses of Washington obviously guard the nation's capital. As Steve mentioned, it was really the most heavily guarded city in the world, especially between 1861 and 1865. So Steve's going to give us a little bit of a background as to, as I said, why are these defenses built? When are they built, and who's going to build them in the early years of the American Civil War, and who's maintaining them between 1861 and 1865. So Steve, I'll kick it over to you to start off.
Thanks, Rich. The defenses of Washington really evolve over the course of the Civil War, and that talks about, and what I mean by that is they grow exponentially in not only size but number. The number of artillery pieces are enlarged. The guns themselves are enlarged. There's different groups of people that will build and expand the forts, which I'll talk about. And the forts actually evolve in accordance to what's going on the battlefields. And they're responding to offensive operations by the Confederate Army, especially in 1862, 63, and 64. So the forts really begin in the spring of 1861 when the federal government and the War Department realized that Virginia indeed will secede from the Union. They had already set plans. They had reconnoitered the ground around Washington, D.C., and they present this information to Winfield Scott, the general-in-chief, the brevet lieutenant general, and they tell him, we need to seize the high ground, especially in Northern Virginia across the Potomac River. So May 22nd, when they realize that Virginia indeed will leave the Union, federal troops in 3 different columns will cross the Potomac River. They'll occupy Arlington Heights, including the Arlington House, the Lee property, and they'll move down to Alexandria the next day. And the following morning, the troops will begin building earthworks. And these were more of I would call them a forward operating base for the Union Army in Virginia, especially under Irvin McDowell. They called it, Army of Occupation in a ways. And so they're going to be there from May through most of July, building about 6 forts. And this will all change or escalate dramatically after the First Battle of Manassas or Bull Run, when the Union Army is literally driven back to the gates of Washington. One of the orders Winfield Scott gives to the commanders in the field is retire to the protection of the fort's guns. So those forts that you see there, Fort Haggerty, Fort Corcoran, Fort Woodbury, Fort Runyon was one of the first forts built. Those are going to be the earliest forts. They will retreat back to Washington, D.C. And by the end of July, this gentleman is recalled, or actually asked or ordered to Washington, D.C. to take over all federal troops in the city. His name is George Brinton McClellan. And under George McClellan, you'll see a rapid expansion of the defenses of Washington, beginning really in August of 1861 through the rest of the year. By the end of 1861, under the supervision of John G. Barnard, the chief engineer of the defenses of Washington, there he is. We call him St. Bernard in Washington, D.C. They consider him the father of the defenses of Washington. And under his supervision, you'll see 48 forts go up by the end of 1861. That number will increase to about 60 by the end of 1862. And by the end of the Civil War, you'll see 68 major forts around Washington, D.C. They're going to be supported by 93 artillery batteries. As I said earlier, about 37 miles of earthworks around the entire city, 30 miles of military road, a few blockhouses. They mounted 800 cannons, heavy cannons, including 100-pound Parrott rifles, 15-inch Rodman guns, and 200-pound Parrott rifles, and about 100 mortars as well. So this will evolve over the course of the war, but that's kind of an introduction to the foundation or the founding of the defenses of Washington.
All right. Thanks, Steve. So as Steve was mentioning, John G. Barnard is going to be one of the architects behind these defenses of Washington, D.C. Barnard was also the architect for the defenses of Pittsburgh. And obviously, we can't really hold a match to the defenses of D.C. I'll admit it here on live air. We can't hold a match to the defenses of D.C. But Barnard was in charge of constructing the defenses around Pittsburgh in the summer of 1863 as Robert E. Lee's army of Northern Virginia was moving up into Pennsylvania. The citizens of Pittsburgh, roughly 11,000 to 12,000 people, had constructed 37 forts around the city of Pittsburgh between June 14th and the first or second week of July under the direction of Barnard. And backing up to 1861, we have the Pennsylvania reserves are really critical in constructing some of these fortifications in DC. And one in particular that I wanted to tackle here is Fort Reno. And let me kind of pull it up here on the screen share.
Hey, before you speak about that, can I kind of describe what these look like real quickly, Rich?
Yeah, go for it.
Because it's interesting. We have these wonderful Civil War sites, about 17 remaining earthworks in Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland. And it's interesting because when visitors come out to these programs, especially children that when I do education programs, and they're looking for the fort, I remember, I'll never forget, well, one boy was like, "Where's the fort at?" And I pointed to a pile of dirt, and he seemed quite disappointed. I think a lot of people expect to see Fort Sumter, these masonry third system fortifications that were prevalent during the 1830s, 40s, even in the 1850s. And these are all made out of earthworks. They're easy to construct. The forts actually were first built by the Union Army. So the guys that will comprise the Army of the Potomac under the command of George McClellan, as tens of thousands of federal troops are sent to Washington, D.C. after Manassas and Bull Run, they're going to be the original fort builders. So these men are going to go up, they're going to cut down trees, and they're going to start piling up piles of dirt and constructing these earthworks for a number of reasons, obviously to protect the Capitol. And the reason why they're using earth is because it's practical, it's incredibly cheap, and these are only temporary. During the course of the war, when the war is over, they're going to knock down the walls and life will return back to normal in a sense. So that's why the majority of the defenses of Washington were destroyed after the Civil War. But I want to read to you real quick General Barnard's description of why these forts went up and the way they went about them. And this is what he writes in his after action report published in 1874. He says, "To meet the emergency, works were necessarily thrown out without that deliberate study of the topography on which the establishment of such a defensive line, if practicable, be used. The first directions given to our laborers were to secure the roads, not merely as the beaten highways of travel from the country to the city, but as, in general, occupying the best ground for the enemy's approach." So they just kind of occupied high ground, started building forts, and only later, beginning in October of 1862, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, he commissions what they call the study of the defenses of Washington, and Barnard and all the Army chiefs will go out, inspect all the forts around Washington, D.C., and realize that there's major design flaws. So that's when you're going to see the massive expansion of the defenses of Washington. They almost add about 20 more forts, and the forts grow in size. For example, Fort Stevens, where the battle will be fought on July 11th and 12th, expands by almost 200 yards, and they're going to add a lot larger artillery pieces as well, especially 16 100-pound Parrott rifles will be dotting the landscape. So you're going to see an evolution of the defenses over the course of the war. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Okay, and kind of backing up to what you were saying before about earthen defenses, for everybody watching, keep in mind that these aren't forts like Fort Sumter or Fort Pulaski or anything like that. These are earthen defenses that are put up for a practical purpose. They aren't like World War I trenches where they're digging deep into the ground and basically living in the ground. This is basically earth that's dug up and put in front of these guys as some kind of defense. And basically what you see in DC is exactly what you're seeing here in Western Pennsylvania when they construct the defenses here. They're designed by the same guy, and they're going to be laid out by the same guy. And so you're going to see a lot of similarities. So the picture I wanted to show you real quick is Fort Reno, or well, the plaque near Fort Reno. Let's see here. And Steve, I think I took this when we had gone up there back in December. Let's see.
Yeah, the highest point in Washington, D.C., and the largest fort built north of the Potomac River was, and Rich will talk about this, originally called Fort Pennsylvania. It was renamed Fort Reno after Major General Jesse Reno.
So yeah, if anybody had not seen it, we did a Facebook Live program back in December from the site of Fort Reno. Fort Reno was originally called Fort Pennsylvania, and it was constructed by elements of the Pennsylvania Reserve Corps. And if anyone's not familiar with the Pennsylvania Reserve Corps, it was, 15 regiments that are recruited from the state of Pennsylvania all across the Commonwealth. And these guys are recruited in July of 1861. Some of the guys you're going to have here are the 11th Pennsylvania Reserves, which are heavily from the Western Pennsylvania area, whether it's around Pittsburgh or Johnstown, etc. And these guys, sign up. They imagine that they're going to go right into combat after enlisting, but instead they're going to be sent down to the DC region and they're going to be put to work. They're handed a shovel and told to construct some of these defenses. And so one of the first defenses to go up is Fort Pennsylvania. Eventually, it's going to be renamed Fort Reno for General Jesse Reno, killed at the Battle of South Mountain in September of 1862. And as Steve mentioned, this is the highest point in the area. And you can see by the photograph, there really isn't a whole lot left of it. There is a marker on the kind of the outer skirts of the fort, but you can see there's a soccer field and a couple other structures in the area. But if you don't really know what you're looking for, you might not find it. So Steve and the other staff members of the Civil War Defenses of Washington are the people to go to when you're looking for sites such as this. Let me just back out of there. All right. And so at that site of Fort Stevens, as I mentioned, you have some of the Pennsylvania Reserves working for quite a while. Actually, I believe it was in December of 1861, Andrew Curtin, governor of Pennsylvania, is going to come observe some of the defenses that his fellow Pennsylvanians had built. And shortly after, in December of 1861, some of these Pennsylvania Reserves are going to see action for the first time at the Battle of Drainesville. But I won't really go into that. I'll start kicking it around here. I know some of you guys have some stories to share. So Cody, we'll start off with you.
Sure. So my story deals with the 93rd Pennsylvania at the Battle of Fort Stevens. I'm going to share my screen of a few images here. For anybody who has followed Penn Civil War since the beginning, our blog in particular, you will know that 93rd Pennsylvania is the first regiment that I chose to focus on this alleged speech that James McCarter, their former colonel, purportedly gave as they were on their way through Manchester, Maryland, on the way to fight at the Battle of Gettysburg. But here we have first just an image. There aren't too many images of which I've came across of the fighting at Fort Stevens, but this is from the 6th Corps unit history, basically published just the year after the war in 1866. And a nice idea there of what appears to be the aftermath of the battle at Fort Stevens. But the 93rd Pennsylvania, which I see right off the bat, I have the wrong regiment labeled at the bottom. I have 63rd. It should be 93rd. In 1911, their regimental history is published. So it's a while after the fact, but I think it's an interesting way of kind of gauging how this battle and the defense, especially of Washington from these men's perspective, really kind of lasted in their view of the war, even several decades after the fact. And so I'll just read a bit of an excerpt here. It was written by Captain Penrose G. Mark. You can see him photographed there. This regiment had enlisted in the fall of 1861, was mustered into service at Lebanon, Pennsylvania. So here's his remembrance of the fighting at Fort Stevens. Again, this is July 11th and 12th, 1864. He said, "The prize for which the rebels were striving was a glittering one, the successful execution of a coup d'etat to capture and occupy the capital of the United States. The moral effect of this capture and its occupancy, if but for a single day, no human mind could compute. It meant practically the dispersion or banishment of the government proper. It meant the destruction of its voluminous archives and perhaps the desecration of its magnificent public buildings. Nay, more. The success of the rebel arms at this thrilling crisis might have prolonged the Civil War for many years, and with a final issue which no human wisdom could foretell. These were tempting allurements for the bold, brave men who staked everything on the success of their cause and who were goaded almost to desperation by the dark clouds of defeat which already encompassed and almost overwhelmed them. Some of the men at their Gettysburg reunion in 1884. For context, this little round top in the background there. He continued in 1911. A new scene now opens upon the drama. A conflict at this time between the rebel veterans and the raw, inexperienced Union troops could have had but one result, the capture of Washington. The 6th Corps had arrived at Washington. The 2nd Division of ours was met at the wharf by President Lincoln and Secretary Stanton at 2 p.m. July 11th, who consulted with our officers. We disembarked amid the cheering of a vast multitude. Among them was the towering form of Abraham Lincoln. His apparel was covered in dust, and every lineament of his countenance indicated a mental strain which almost prostrated him. He chatted familiarly with the superior officers, telling them to hurry up and not lose a moment. Much was involved in the developments of the next few hours, and no one knew this better than the president himself. Our column was formed at once, and the scarred, ragged, and hungry veterans were hurried up 7th Street on the double quick, and in passing along were cordially welcomed and hospitably treated to refreshments by loyal citizens who stood along the pavements and passed it upon the men. We marched to the north of the city, the sound of heavy cannonading in our front stimulated and hastening our progress. Early in the evening, we reached the grove in the rear of Fort de Russy, a little to the left of Fort Stevens. And here, within the shadows of the forest trees, the sweltering veterans of the 1st and 2nd Divisions laid down to rest, the last rest for some of them on earth. The miniature valley in front of the fort was one of surpassing loveliness, with its green meadows, tempting orchards, and fields of waving grain. And the formation and advance of our skirmish line was easy, and but a few minutes elapsed before we were on the firing line and driving the rebels back. And he relates that on that evening of July 11th, they lost one man killed, William Holtzman in Company A. He then said that on Thursday, July 12th, the morning opened bright and glorious, and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, President Lincoln and his wife were driven up to Fort Stevens by their coachman. And just at this moment, the white puffs of smoke along the rebel skirmish line burst forth with a deadly force, and the bullets were whizzing around and about the fort with fearful effect. President Lincoln looked tremulous and careworn, as hope and fear alternated on his strongly lined countenance, and he seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. Penrose Mark remembered that there were 54 men killed and 319 wounded in their brigade, which made a charge in, quote, splendid order. The rebels made a stout and vigorous resistance at the summit of the hill, supported by their second line of battle, but failed to hold it. And as darkness closed in upon the bloody scene, our corps, this would be the 6th Corps, were the victors, having driven the rebels over a mile. The president's face was fairly wreathed with smiles. He concluded his remembrance of Fort Stevens by saying this: President Lincoln stood closer to the hearts of the soldiers than any other, and so obviously it meant a lot to have fought in front of him. A large part of the patriotism of the soldiers was their love for Abraham Lincoln. He was to them the personification of the country. He meant more to them than Uncle Sam. He was Father Abraham. The soldiers said among themselves, "He cares for us, he loves us," and they cheerfully marched into the jaws of death for him. And I think that his final paragraphs are really telling of how they placed this battle of Fort Stevens in the grand context of the war, and I'll end with this. That was the proudest day of its existence when the 6th Corps at the Battle of Fort Stevens enjoyed the lone distinction of fighting before President Lincoln, and in enduring action declared it the protection of the national capital for the 3rd time. First in the Antietam campaign, second in the Gettysburg campaign, third when the national capital was menaced July 12, 1864. Was that not a proud distinction to be placed 3 times against nearest the national capital to defend it from the invader? And so I think that in that, like I said, we can find kind of an interesting way that at least this one select group of Pennsylvanians and the man who served as their regimental historian chose to recall their role in the defenses at Washington, and in particular, the fighting at Fort Stevens.
So if I could jump in real quick, we have a comment in the comment section from, I think it was from, let's see who it was from. Hold on. Let me see. Well, I lost it. I lost who said it. But it was that this, if you could, Cody, at some point post the quotes about Lincoln,
Sure.
because they're pretty moving, about him operating in the field.
Yep.
That was Civil War Trails.
Yep. So Civil War Trails, Drew Gruber, shout out.
Hey, Drew.
Come on, Drew. Yeah, it's very well said, and Steve can agree to this, that pretty much every unit that was in the vicinity of Fort Stevens that day fighting, claimed that President Lincoln had seen them fighting and took pride in their unit. I honestly, the 102nd and 139th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiments, which are Western Pennsylvania Infantry Regiments, I believe they're brigaded together at that time. Yeah. Two of my favorite, most hard fighting regiments in the American Civil War, the 102nd, 139th, right there at Fort Stevens. Steve, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say real quickly to what Cody was speaking of, especially on July 9th, July 11th, is, the first 6th Corps soldier to get killed in action is William Holtzman, and you can still see his grave today. And I'll talk about that at the end of our chat today about Battleground National Cemetery. But there are 12 Pennsylvania soldiers interred at the National Cemetery who were killed or mortally wounded at the Battle of Fort Stevens. So we'll definitely talk about that. I do want the viewers to understand that the forts were built systematically and scientifically in a way that they could mutually support each other if they came under enemy attack or fire. So the forts were built 800 to 1,000 yards apart. So if the Confederate Army or cavalry is making a dash towards one of the forts, Fort Stevens will be the main focus of the Battle of Fort Stevens because it sits right on top of the 7th Street Road. We call that Georgia Avenue today. Early's army came under heavy fire from multiple forts, including Fort Reno, which Rich talked about at the beginning of the program, Fort Jerussi, which Cody talked about, Fort Slocum, Fort Totten, all firing in the same direction towards the Confederate Army, who were advancing south on the 7th Street Road towards Washington, D.C. And I want to share this really quick. I believe this is the best description of the defenses of Washington from the Confederate perspective. And let me read this to the visitors very quickly and just kind of understand how complex this system of fortification was. I actually call it Fortress Washington, a system of fortifications to protect the federal capital. And this Confederate officer, this is a hint, by the way, writes this: on the morning of the 11th, July 11th, we continued the march, but the day was so excessively hot, even at a very early hour in the morning, and the dust so dense that many of the men fell by the way, and it became necessary to slacken our pace. Nevertheless, when we reached the right of the enemy's fortification, the men were almost completely exhausted and not in a condition to make an attack. Skirmishers were thrown out and moved up to the vicinity of the fortifications. These we found to be very strong and constructed very scientifically. They consist of a circle of enclosed forts connected by breastworks with ditches, palisades, and abattis in front, and every approach swept by a crossfire of artillery, including some heavy guns. The person that wrote that was none other than Jubal Early, commanding the Confederate Army at the Battle of Fort Stevens, and he wrote this after-action report to General Robert E. Lee. So I believe that is an incredible account or description of what the defense of Washington looked like from the Confederate perspective.
That's a very great account. And I was going to actually say, when you were finishing up, that guy must not have been late.
He was.
That's my dad joke of the evening.
Oh, okay, here we go.
Hey, Steve, quick question for you here from somebody posted on mine, Tom Sobol.
Yes.
He said, how early did the U.S. Army start using enslaved African Americans to construct the defenses of Washington?
1862. So as I said, 48 forts were constructed by the U.S. Army engineers and then just the infantry soldiers themselves. But after George McClellan leaves for the Peninsula Campaign in March of 1862, and the large influx of African Americans formerly enslaved coming into the city explodes. We believe 40 to 50,000 formerly enslaved African Americans find refuge in Washington, D.C. during the course of the war. And so not only are they coming from Virginia, they're coming from Maryland as well, which is creating a lot more issues because Maryland is a border state. The Fugitive Slave Act remains in force. So there's going to be a lot of tension between federal soldiers and slave owners from Maryland, especially right on the border there. But as by 62, summer of 62, and into late 1862, you're going to see African Americans formerly enslaved being hired on to work on the forts, expand the forts, and then by 1863, you're going to see the raising of the 1st Regiment United States Colored Troops in Washington, D.C. So that's going to really happen in 1862 and expand over the course of the war. That's a great question, by the way. And that's something that, as I talked about, the defenses evolved over the course of the war. So you've got the soldiers constructing the forts, and then you've got civilians and, just laborers, and then formerly enslaved African Americans as well, expanding the forts and building the new ones as well.
All right. And moving on to Kendrick, what do you have for us tonight?
So we talked about some infantry. I figured we go to the Heavies, the heavy artillery regiments. There are several of them that are going to man a lot of these forts, not only in the defenses of Washington, but all these large United States Army forts that are all around the East Coast. A lot of these men are going to join these heavy artillery regiments. I like to think of the heavy artillery regiments almost as like the National Guard, like during Vietnam. A lot of guys will enlist in those regiments because they know they're not going to see much action because they're going to be manning these forts with these large siege guns. And of course, that ends up not being true in 1864 with the Battle of Fort Stevens. But for majority of their enlistments, that will happen. But things will change once we get to the Petersburg campaign for a lot of these heavy artillery regiments. They'll be moved down to Petersburg and put on the front lines, which happens to the 2nd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery, who I'm going to be talking about over the next several minutes. I have a little bit of a connection to the 2nd PA. Everybody here on the panel knows that I love personal connections. My 4th great-grandfather, George Washington Briggs, was a private in the 2nd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery. He was not at the defenses of Washington. He enlisted right in the summer of 1864 after they'd been sent to Petersburg, but he missed out on all the fun there at the forts, right, Steve?
He would have had a lot of splinters in his hands from piling up dirt for the walls, but
well, I'm sure he got a lot of splinters in his hands down and digging ditches down in
Petersburg as well.
Sure.
That's a good point.
So he got, I guess he got to have some fun around some other forts, just not the ones in DC. But the 2nd PA Heavy Artillery is kind of a unique unit in the Civil War because it is the largest regiment to serve in the Union Army, over 5,000 officers and enlisted men over the course of one time or another, not all together, but over the course of its existence, which goes from January of 1862 until January of 1866. It is they started recruiting in October of 61 in Philadelphia, also in Allegheny County, Pittsburgh connection there, Rich. Also Franklin County in central Pennsylvania and Monroe County in northeastern PA. So kind of pulling from all sorts of areas. Now, my ancestors from York, Pennsylvania, which is also south central, not too far from Franklin. So they were pulling from all over the state. When the 10 companies were mustered in 1862, they were ordered to DC right off the bat. And they spent the next 2 years constructing and garrisoning various fortifications in the city. One of those is actually Fort Stevens. But most of some of the images that are in their unit history are from Fort Lincoln. So there's that Lincoln connection. I do know that they mention, and maybe you could help me out here, Steve. They mentioned that they are in Fort Slocum, which I know is on that north side.
Yep.
But then they also mentioned Fort Massachusetts, and they mentioned that both of those forts are on the left of Fort Totten. What is Fort Massachusetts?
Great question. Fort Massachusetts it's renamed Fort Stevens.
Oh, okay. So there we go. So it's
yeah,
Fort Stevens.
the center of the Confederate attack or advancement on July 11th and 12th, 64.
Okay. So these guys spend 2+ years in these forts, and there's nothing going on around DC in terms of any sort of military conflict until we get to Fort Stevens. So I wanted to read a really unique story out of the unit history for the 2nd PA Heavy Artillery about discipline among the men and also the officers. And I think we don't really think about these issues when thinking about the monotony of life in a camp. You know, a lot of these men in infantry regiments, they're moving from one place to another once the resources run out within a campsite. So then they keep moving and they're on campaign. The only time they get in this monotonous life is during the winter camp. So these men are doing this for 2 years straight in the same general location. So I'll read a little piece from this. Discipline in the regiment at this time, meaning in the spring of 1862, was very lax. Officers from colonel down to lieutenants mingled and messed with the non-commissioned officers and privates, thus tending to divert the latter of respect and obedience due the former, and consequently preventing the regiment from attaining any special degree of encomium among the inhabitants of Washington or the powers that be. Colonel Angeroth seemed to take little pride in the regiment, spending more than one half of his time in Washington, leaving no one in particular to look after the wants of the regiment, and the men done pretty much as they please. The different characteristics of the officers and men soon began to show themselves. The majority of them were faithful, patriotic, and earnest, and rapidly advanced in knowledge and usefulness. There was the usual number of derelicts that are inevitable accompaniments of any times of excitement and especially of war. Soon there began to be rumors that the officers were not military men and did not know how to drill and get the best service out of the men. The state officials at Harrisburg were very jealous of the care, discipline, and efficiency of the volunteers and were in such close touch with them at any complaint, even from enlisted men who would receive consideration. This whale of complaint finally gathered in such volume that an examining board was appointed to test the field officers to see if they were competent to handle such an important body of men. These examining boards were an expeditious way of getting rid of the inefficient officers. Some of the field officers were ordered before the board and were found so incompetent that they were advised to resign, which they did. But if they had not resigned, charges would have been preferred and they would have been tried by court-martial. It was a bitter disappointment to them. They were happy and contented in their positions, and it is said that one of them remarked, "Why could they not let us alone? We were all making such a good living." This wholesale retirement of officers naturally resulted in demoralizing the entire regiment somewhat. Desertions became frequent, and the process of weeding out those who were not fully able-bodied reduced the regiment so rapidly that recruiting again became necessary. And I think this plays into why the regiment had so many men over the course of its time because of this. For instance, my ancestor only signed a 1-year enlistment, probably with a bounty, because he first enlisted in a 3-month regiment at the beginning of the war, and then had children and a family to go home to, and then re-enlisted in 1964. So it seems that there is a lot of issues that are going to happen over the course of their time in the forts. And I'm sure the 2nd PA Heavy Artillery is not the only one to have issues. There was another piece in here after that I found very interesting. After the drafts and push for enlistments in 1862, and I know Jake and I have a very big vested interest in the drafts of Pennsylvania in the fall of 1862, and plus the push for those 9-month regiments. Some of those 9-month regiments are actually going to be trained in drill by the 2nd PA Heavy Artillery in the forts in the fall of 1862. And it's the 136th and 137th PA Volunteers. On August 29th, they were sent to the forts that were occupied by the 2nd PA Heavy Artillery and were drilled in artillery and infantry tactics by both the officers and enlisted men of those regiments, both officers and men of the former regiments being mixed with promiscuously with squads of the latter regiment for that purpose. So they trained together before they ended up moving out. I think so. Those two regiments were actually sent to the Army of the Potomac on September 7th near South Mountain, and they left a lot of their supplies behind, and those supplies were stored at Fort Totten. So kind of another little interesting fact there. I'm sure you have some stuff to add there, Steve.
I was going to say, discipline was a major issue in the defenses of Washington. The officers try to keep the soldiers busy, working on the earthworks. They test fired the large, massive artillery pieces about twice a week, including firing in the vicinity of occupied houses. So the civilians in Virginia talk about that as well. But there was a lot of issues in DC. So I actually went down to the National Archives late 2019, early 2020. I started going through the records of the Provost Marshal of the Department of Washington, also called the 22nd Army Corps. And I actually shared this account with people on my personal account. I just want to give you an example of the issues in Washington, D.C. with the defenders at D.C. And this was a court-martial against one Patrick Connor. He was an ordnance sergeant. It says United States Army, so not specifically a volunteer regiment or even a regular regiment. It just said U.S. Army. He was charged with conduct to do the good of order and military discipline. And this is one of my favorite accounts that I've come across in D.C. The specification says, Sergeant Connor, by the use of intoxicating liquor, became intoxicated and was found lying near the road in a gross state of intoxication. So intoxicated, and intoxication in one charge. This was February 8th, 1863. Fort DeRussy is one of our most popular sites, by the way. The earthworks are in very good condition. He was found guilty and sentenced to forfeit all pay due and to become due, and was dishonorably discharged from the service of the U.S. So I came across dozens and dozens of accounts of soldiers, mostly through alcohol or harassing local citizens, being discharged or sent to do like manual labor type stuff around DC. So it's not a common occurrence. So I'll say that. Or not.
It sounds like what happens when Rich Condon visits Washington.
That's or Gettysburg. Remember that, Rich?
Just nope. But yeah, it's just us channeling our inner bored federal soldiers. If you read any accounts, even here in Pittsburgh, after the defenses are somewhat completed in July of 1863, you see a lot of these people start turning to the bottle out of boredom. We've completed our task. We built these defenses. Now what do? We just start drinking.
Party.
So Jake, aren't you going to talk about the PA reserves at Fort Pennsylvania?
Yes. So I was diligent, or I was not diligent, leading up to this video. So Steve was nice enough to hand me off a good primary source to read to all of you. I don't have any poetry for you this evening, unfortunately. But what I do have is a poorly read German Pennsylvania accent. So Steve supplied me with this letter that was written in August of 1861.
You drink enough Yingling, I think you can channel your inner German for this one.
Yeah, I just went over to Steve hiding behind the general.
Hold on,
Excellent.
let's get this guy up
So Steve may or may not have been aware of my Pennsylvania Dutch heritage. So
I was on.
I appreciate this, Steve.
Yes.
So I can trace my roots to some Pennsylvania Germans myself. But this is a letter that was written in August of 1861 by Adam S. Bray of the 3rd Pennsylvania Reserves. I am going to utterly butcher this Pennsylvania Dutch accent. What I love about the Pennsylvania Dutch is that you can read the way they spoke. They wrote the way that they spoke, and this is going to be fun. So think of it as, it's kind of like poetry, right? Okay, so this is what he wrote. quote, "We are busy in building a battery. It is mate very strong and good to protect our soldiers. It holds about 2,000 men's. It is mounted with 3 cannons. One of them weighs 4,800 pounds. We expect more cannons yet. We cut down orchards with fine apple and peach trees with fine peaches, and also large cornfields. We have destroyed 2 houses that were in our way to build the battery."
Yes.
So that is his letter of building Fort.
That was really good.
Fort Pennsylvania, which becomes Fort Reno in a little bit later during the Civil War. So somewhere my Pennsylvania Dutch ancestors are probably in an uproar. And
They're rolling in their graves right now.
Yeah, they're not happy with me. But thanks, Steve. I appreciate that.
I was going to say, and there's also, you know who shows up to Fort Pennsylvania? The governor, Andrew Curtin.
Oh,
So-
great war governor.
That's right, the war governor himself.
Didn't I mention that earlier, Steve?
I don't know, did you?
I most definitely did.
No,
It's
you
all right.
When did that
Main
happen,
man,
Rich?
Andrew Gregg.
1861.
What month?
About December,
No, that's not right.
November. It was
No,
November.
that's not right either. September 10th, 1861, Andrew Curtin shows up, accompanied by Abraham Lincoln, by the way, and they present colors and they review the Pennsylvania Reserve Division. So John Reynolds is there. George Meade is there. He's probably very angry because that's what George Meade does. And so our friend Jared Frederick would be very happy to know that Andrew Curtin visited Fort Pennsylvania and reviewed the troops with President Lincoln.
Where is Jared? Is he watching this? We should get him in on this.
I know.
I have never
It
noticed
happens
if he's
sometimes.
watched him or not, but he should be watching them. The same.
All
We'll
right.
tag
We're going to start wrapping it up here, but I'd first like to start the end with Steve. Steve, what do you have for us regarding, you said you want to talk a little bit about Battlegrounds Cemetery.
Yeah, so Battleground National Cemetery was established almost immediately after the Battle of Fort Stevens. Battleground National Cemetery, appropriately entitled, located about a half-mile north of Fort Stevens on Georgia Avenue. That's a historic image of it. Between 1865 and 1871 or so, they build a lodge there, designed by Montgomery Meigs, by the way, the Quartermaster General of the Army. And that's actually my office now, is Battleground National Cemetery. And
Is it that little building out there?
It was that little building.
it is, it's got really good Wi-Fi access as well. So, well, in regards to Pennsylvania troops and Battleground National Cemetery, they started burying soldiers there immediately after the battle, mostly on July 13th, the day after the last major action, when the 6th Corps advances north from Fort Stevens, attacks the Confederate Army, and there's going to be a heavy firefight about a half-mile north of Fort Stevens, around this area, and also near the Walter Reed National Medical Center. That's where the Confederate bivouac was at. And fortunately for us historians, and then the family members of these soldiers, there was a conscientious officer that took down the names of the soldiers that were being brought in. They were buried on this property here, about 1 acre of land. It was owned by a DC Metro police officer. You can imagine he was not very happy that the Union Army was burying soldiers on his property. So he does what we do best. He sued the bastards. He sued the government. They wrote him a nice check in 1867. But there are 12 Pennsylvania troops interred at Battleground National Cemetery, one of the smallest national cemeteries in the country, by the way. And I think it'd only be appropriate if we honor these men from the Keystone State. And I'm going to read off their names real quick. From the 61st Pennsylvania, there is Private Andrew Ashball, Private Philip Bowen, Private John Ellis, and Private George Laughlin. This is a shout out to my friend, Ranger Ron Harvey, who did about 10 years of research, my friends, and found out that 5 of the names were mislabeled. So 5 of the headstones were actually mislabeled. It was originally believed that George Garvin from the 61st PA was buried there. His actual name was Edward Garvin, excuse me. He was a corporal. and there was an H. McIntyre. His actual name was Thomas McIntyre. He was a private. He used the alias of Thomas Morrison. So Ron Harvey spent 10 years doing research and was able to discover that 5 of the names were mislabeled. I believe this one was the hardest. Cody, this is in your honor, my friend. 93rd Pennsylvania, William Holtzman is interred at Battleground National Cemetery. From the 98th Pennsylvania, we have 4 soldiers, Bernard Horley, George Marquette, Charles Seahouse, and Frederick Walther. And from the 139th Pennsylvania, there is George Milton Richards. And then I'll conclude by saying at Battleground National Cemetery, we have 4 monuments that were dedicated by federal troops or veterans. The 98th Pennsylvania Volunteers dedicated their monument in 1891. It was the first monument to go up at Battleground National Cemetery. So huzzah to the Keystone State.
Huzzah.
Out of the Keystone.
Oh, and Rich, one last thing.
Yeah.
I would mention that there are at least 12 forts and batteries named after men from Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, they're generally named after someone that was killed or died of disease, including Charles F. Smith, John Reynolds, of course, Grable, John Grable, Montgomery Meigs, Jesse Reno. We talked about Fort Reno, Seneca Simmons, Adam Slemmer, and so on and so forth. So there is a very proud representation of Pennsylvania soldiers in the defenses of Washington.
Which similarly they did in Pittsburgh in October of 1864. Some of the 37 defenses that were built around the city were renamed for federal officers from the area or even just from Pennsylvania who had fallen in the what?
Fort Permanente, huh? Sweet.
Fort Permanentes. One of them was James Childs, Fort Childs, who's killed at Antietam. You had Fort Fulton, which was named for John Fulton Reynolds. For some reason, they went with his middle name.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
But anyway, there's a few parallels between the defenses that are built around here and the ones that are built in DC, even though obviously the ones built in Pittsburgh are less superior, according to Steve Phan. But there are many similarities, and I first off want to thank everyone for watching tonight. Hopefully you've learned a bit about the Civil War defenses of Washington and the important role they played between 1861 and 1865. If you have any more questions, you can feel free to reach out to Pennsylvania Civil War, or more specifically, reach out to Steve here at the Civil War Defenses of Washington. You can go to their webpage or their Facebook. They also have an Instagram, and you can reach out and they'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. So before we wrap up, I just kind of want to go around and see if he has any final comments for the end of the evening. So we start off with you.
With me? Oh, sorry.
Cody.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, it skipped for me too. I couldn't hear who you said. I just want to leave us with a brief anecdote here of a Major John Crosby. Talk about Pittsburgh names there. Crosby of the 61st Pennsylvania. He had been wounded in the Wilderness in May of 1864, and he was being treated at a hospital in Washington, D.C. And he hears that the 6th Corps is arriving, including his old regiment, the 61st Pennsylvania. Awesome. And when he learns that they are moving past his hospital, which was apparently near the Smithsonian Institute, he files basically this application to rejoin the regiment. And the regimental historian later recalled that his application was refused on the ground that his wound in the head was not sufficiently healed to permit wearing a hat or going where there was dust, and overheating would be dangerous. Nevertheless, Crosby went to a stable, hired a horse, and joined the regiment, taking command as he was the ranking officer. When nearing the regiment at Fort Stevens, having returned his horse, a fellow officer met Crosby, who was then on foot, and begged him to return because of his feeble condition. This he refused to do, saying, "I must go to my boys." And he'll eventually be one of 25 men wounded and loses an arm as a result of it. And then he is killed in action at the breakthrough at Petersburg on April 2nd, 1865. So an interesting anecdote there dealing with the commitment to the action at Fort Stevens for Crosby of the 61st Pennsylvania.
That's the
All
first time
right.
I've heard that account. Thanks for sharing, Cody.
Kendrick, what do you have to say?
I guess I could say, maybe to steal some words from Rich, wash your hands, don't touch your face. Those are very important. But yeah, Steve, we're gonna have to get together and go through the forts, because I have yet to have been down to the defenses. So when all this lets up, maybe we'll do some live streams down there at some point. But
Absolutely. Look forward
yeah,
to it.
and learn more about Pennsylvania and their role in the forts, because I really don't know much about what happens there and who's there over the course of the Civil War. So that'll be really cool. But yeah, just keep an eye out on our blogs and our Facebook pages. I'm posting in the comments all of our blogs because somebody asked about them. Definitely want to make sure that people know aware that those are there and for your reading pleasure while you're on quarantine. So that's all I have.
All right, Steve, how about you?
Well, yeah, I'd like to thank Pennsylvania and the Civil War for having me on. I know we're all friends and colleagues, so it's good to do this. And to all the viewers, I appreciate everyone being on here. And as Rich just mentioned, I'd love to have you follow us on our Facebook page, Civil War Defenses of Washington. It's a National Park Service page. Our website, www.mps.gov/CWDW, and our Instagram page as well at Civil War Defenses of Washington. As Rich and kind of the gents are talking about here, with the pandemic going on and stuff, it's hard to obviously have people out. We've canceled all of our programs in person, but we're still doing a lot of virtual stuff. We're doing a lot of digital media, shooting a lot of videos and sharing them with the public. But once this is over, if you're ever in Washington D.C. and want to see the Defenses of Washington, just hit us up on one of our social media pages or website, and we'd be more than willing to show you around and check out the really cool historic earthworks. And by the way, if anyone from Pennsylvania or have descendants that or ancestors that served in the Defenses of Washington, please let me know. I'm working on a project to feature soldiers and civilians that served in the Defenses of Washington. It was supposed to be released to the public when this all started, so I've pushed it back until this is over. So the project is called Faces of the Forts, and we're documenting soldiers, civilians, formerly enslaved African Americans, freed African Americans. We've got many accounts of women that were in and around the Defenses of Washington, including the 31st PA, the famous image of the soldier, his wife, children, and their dog that happened in the Defenses of Washington. So if anyone has any connection towards the Capitol forts, please reach out to us. We'd be honored to feature your family history in our project. So to my friends, Jake, Cody, and Mr. Gibbs, and then of course Rich Condon, the Defenses of Pittsburgh, a bunch of log guns, about 17 defenders, and a couple piles of dirt. But I appreciate you having me on, my friend. It's been a lot of fun.
And we could get more into that at some point.
Oh, we will.
I have some good accounts for you. But anyway,
Oh, that's true. Okay.
We'll move on to Jake. What do you have to say?
Not too much. Just put a new piece up on the website, PennCivilWar.com today. Rich and I have been working in the very early stages of a project on the 57th Pennsylvania veteran volunteer infantry. And so the piece up there is a fascinating letter that was written to the survivors of the unit in July of 1865 when they were mustered out. They lost just under 400 men over the course of their wartime service to disease and battle. But this letter really spoke to me. I'm a huge fan of the HBO series Band of Brothers, the book as well, Band of Brothers. Of course, that quote well predates the Civil War. It goes back to William Shakespeare, Henry V. But this letter Um, and John Reynolds is back.
Yes.
This letter that's written in 1865 does reference that band of brothers. Quote, and I'll just read just a snippet of it here. Going to give you a preview. The post is about the letter itself, and it says, quote, "Parting as a band of brothers, let us cling to the memory of those tattered banners under which we fought together, and which, without dishonor, we now just restored to the authorities who placed them in our hands. Till we grow gray-headed and pass away, let us sustain the reputation of the noble regiment, for none can point to one more glorious." So it's not poetry, but I thought it was pretty moving, and that's going to be my last word for the evening.
That might as well be poetry. It's very moving. And I'd like to thank all of you guys, and I'd like to thank Steve and General Reynolds for joining us this evening.
That's right.
My final comment, per usual, is wash your hands, wash your face, don't touch your face. Let's use a lot of hand sanitizer, wear masks, wear gloves, whatever you have to do so we can go back to normal life and start doing these from the actual battlefield in groups. And then I'll be much happier. Everyone, thank you for tuning in tonight. And we'll be happy to bring you these here. And in the very near future, we'll be announcing more of these Zoom discussions on our Facebook page, etc. So thank you very much, everyone.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.